come to our today's discussion. Uh, as you have experience to work in nutrition areas as well as child nutrition development perspective, I think early childhood is a major time for human beings for development of nutrition. Though we used to we know that pregnancy time also important for nutrition development for human beings. But what is your general observation about the recent activities in nutrition and early childhood development? Can you share with us what is happening in Bangladesh and other developing countries?
So I'm not a nutritionist, but I was asked by the director of BRAC, Dr. Mahbub Hussain, to start a unit in the BRAC Research and Evaluation Division called the Impact Assessment Unit. So we developed techniques for rigorous impact assessment of projects. And BRAC was doing a wide range of projects. And nutrition is an important objective because Bangladesh has done quite well on Millennium Development Goals, but not really in nutrition. So progress in nutrition has probably been not as good as one might have expected. I mean, in principle, you would expect with a certain increase in GDP, you should see improvements in nutrition, but that hasn't really happened. And I think nutrition is particularly important for childhood development, and I certainly include the period in pregnancy in the 1,000 days and all that. But it's important because of the acquisition of cognitive skills and development of capacity of children. And if they don't develop in that time, then they won't catch up later. And it really affects their later education and their future life. So I think there's a very close link between educational development and stimulation of children and nutrition. And the reason I got involved in it, I mean, I was interested in it generally, and I'm interested in MDGs and SDGs overall. But we were asked in Impact Assessment Unit to do, we were contacted to see if we could do a rigorous impact assessment of a BRAC program. And I think it was quite an interesting program because it includes early child development and nutrition, and they're combined. So we were asked to try and make an evaluation of that, a rigorous evaluation, to see to what extent it was working and whether we could learn lessons from that experience which could be applied elsewhere. And that's been my main involvement in nutrition, really. So if we want to talk about that, we can move on to the PowerPoint presentation when you're ready.
Okay, please. Okay, yeah. Please go ahead.
Well, I'll try and get that up on the screen then. Okay. So,
yeah.
Right. So this is actually, I was not, in the paper we sent you on this, I'm not a co-author, but I was the coordinator of the team which undertook it. So that's why I know quite a lot about it. This was a presentation which was given, I think, at a workshop in Manila by some people from the Health, Nutrition and Pop program of BRAC, but also by my colleague Farzana, who was a member of the rigorous impact evaluation team which carried out the study. So first of all, we had a project integrating health, nutrition and stimulation in the early period of life as an initiative for holistic development. And I think this was a really good idea because I think these things really fit together. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the project, and then I'm also going to talk about the results of the evaluation. I was not involved in implementing the project, but I was involved in the evaluation. Okay, so it started in 2013 in 5 units, and it scaled up.
Please.
Yeah, okay. If there are any questions, just ask me as I go along, and I'll try and answer them.
Okay.
Yeah, and then we scaled up to 6 upazillas in Mymensingh, and there were 240 early childhood centers established. And BRAC was already running a very interesting program for adolescents, which had a lot of involvement of adolescent girls, which is an interesting program in itself. We did an evaluation of that too. But these adolescents in the ADP, Adolescent Development Program, they were trained as promoters for early childhood development. So the target was pregnant and lactating mothers, children up to 5, and parents, including fathers and caregivers. And essentially, it focused on a whole range of things: maternal care, nutrition, mental health. BRAC had an extensive health program, so they could refer women in particular during antenatal period for complications, education on parenting, newborn care, breastfeeding, referral of sick newborns, and then later on, education on parenting, appropriate diet, monitoring of child development, and then as they got older, different types of play, community involvement, and so on. And then they tracked the children graduating from this program to see how well they performed in primary and later on in secondary school. And we could do that because BRAC also had an education program with non-formal education, so they could track these children through that program. So it was a pretty comprehensive program, starting with home-based care and learning, and then going on to center-based care and learning. And I'm not going to read all the content of the slides, but essentially there was nutritional interventions. Now, a very important point here was that BRAC did not provide nutritional supplements, or only a very limited amount, I think, during pregnancy. It was about really basically nutrition education and knowledge with some demonstrations, but it was linked to other forms of things like hygiene and so on. So it was not primarily distributing nutrition, food or supplements. It was basically about information. And it went on, starting with pregnancy, and it went on up to 60 months. This is just the information of where the program was running. And then we wanted to work out how we would develop instruments and methods to measure results on this. And we adapted measurement instruments. This was done, the evaluation program was done jointly with an American institute, and they wanted to use international standards for measuring early childhood development. So we adapted international ways of measurement to local conditions. But then on nutrition, we continued with the normal measurements of weight and height, and we developed some electronic methods of measurement as well. Now, I'm going to go into all the details of the numbers, but essentially we saw a substantial improvement in stunting. So we found evidence for a much lower level of stunting in the treatment group. It seemed to result from improvement in dietary diversity, which was very good because that was the kind of message which was being put across. There was better antenatal visits. And then the fourth point here is very important. The data showed that wasting and stunting was improved much more in households where the primary caregiver, which is the mother basically, did not complete primary school. So if the mother did not complete primary school, she tended not to adopt the messages in terms of improved nutrition. She tended to continue with traditional feeding practices for herself in pregnancy and also for small children. And that's a very interesting finding. Now, the first thought is if less educated mothers don't adopt the messages, maybe that's because the messages require literacy and you need education to understand the messages. But that was not the case. The messages were very carefully developed so they could be easily understood even by illiterate mothers. So in that case, why was education so important in improving nutrition? Okay, so I'll come back to that in a minute. The positive results in stunting are associated with positive effects of BRAC nutrition program on complementary feeding practices and food security for children 6 months and older. Now, we think the effect of education was because mothers who had primary education were much more confident in themselves, and they were able to listen to and respond to the messages which the program was giving them on dietary diversity, and they did not listen to their mothers-in-law as much. And the mothers who did not have primary education tended to follow the instructions or advice of their mothers-in-law. So they tended to be much more traditional. So education was important because it gave mothers confidence in accessing information and making use of information, which uneducated mothers did not have. So we found a very close link between primary education and improvements in nutrition. Yeah, so this is about the bargaining power. So we found that in the treatment group,
Andrew, I have just one point to ask you here. As you said that, education is very much important in terms of, giving the confidence. So if I ask you that uneducated mother, but she has economical empowerment, and, educated mother, but she does not have economical empowerment, which is, more important for having confidence.
Yeah, well, that's very hard to say. But one thing we know about stunting and wasting in Bangladesh is that it doesn't seem to be related to income very much. That, you don't, even when incomes rise, stunting and wasting are not improving very much. So what seems to be much more important is the access to information. And the use of the information on diversified feeding seems to be much more related to education level rather than economic level. So you can have families which are really quite well off, but they still continue with traditional feeding practices. And those traditional feeding practices do not improve nutrition and do not reduce stunting and wasting. So I would tend to say that the confidence generated by education is a critical factor, and it may be independent of economic, to some extent at least, to quite a large extent, independent of economic status. Okay, the one thing, before I talk about the conclusions, there's one other really interesting thing, and that is how we managed to generate a comparison group, because the important thing here were the use of the comparison group. And the project had already been running for 6 or 7 years before we did the rigorous impact assessment. So normally you would do a baseline and an end line, or you might even try to do randomized control trial with randomized assignment, but that wasn't possible in this case. So we had to try to construct a comparison group. And actually what we did was, we did 2 rounds of identification. The first was using the census, I think it was the national census and the agricultural census data, where we identified places adjacent where we could find a group which was very similar for all kinds of economic and social indicators to the treatment group. And then using the treatment group and the comparison group, we did a technique called propensity score matching, where we discarded people from the group, both the treatment and the comparison, who didn't match up. So we ended up with 2 very well matched groups, and we were able to do that long after the project had started. In fact, roughly the time the project was ending. So we ended up with 2 groups which matched on all kinds of characteristics except nutritional status. So then we were able to see the effect of the nutrition program on those groups and the difference between the treatment and the comparison group. And that's what was important for the study. Okay, so these are the important conclusions. Conclusion 1, the nutrition program, and as I said, the nutrition program was mainly based on information rather than distributing material. It was mainstreamed in the BRAC maternal, neonatal and child health package with an early child development element as well. It seems to create a difference in stunting vis-a-vis the national level. So I think we saw a reduction in stunting from, I think, 28% to 21%, which is quite substantial. The reductions seem to result from improvements in dietary diversity and in food security. And we found that the positive effects in the study and the program were driven by those primary caregivers with some education, they were the ones who were actually changing and achieving better results. Whereas primary caregivers with no education were not actually changing very much and were not getting much improvement. And we believe that the effects was mediated because they had improved bargaining power within their family, and it was not about access to knowledge. All of the people in the treatment group got knowledge, but only some of them responded to the knowledge, and those were the ones, quite a lot of them, but only not all, and they were the ones who had access to improved bargaining power, and we believe that was caused by their improved education. Okay, so that's the summary of the program.
Thank you, Andrew. When you share about this summary, it insisted me to ask you what are the insight you gain you work in different projects, like you also involved in child library project and other development related Bangladesh. So what is your gain? How do you like to share with us?
Yeah, well, I mean, what I feel is that we need to identify some key issues, and I think nutrition is certainly a key issue. We want to see development in relation to all of the sustainable development goals, but some of them are very important. Now, what we learn in Bangladesh relative to the progress on the Millennium Development Goals, for example, is that nutrition was held back. And I think that's a real concern because I think nutrition is important. And I think there's quite a lot of international evidence to suggest it's important for early child development, and that's important for subsequent education development in terms of social activity and income and so on and so forth. So when we identify areas which are being held back, it's then important to try to find out through pilot schemes and through rigorous evaluation of those schemes, what is the reason which is holding them back? I mean, we did similar types of research, for example, on early marriage. What's causing early marriage? And we got some quite interesting results there too. So the basic lesson is, let's try and find out what the problem is and see if we can find a solution which actually works. And in this case, the solution which worked was improved knowledge about diversification of diet within the 1,000 days. And I think that that's interesting. And it also showed that education is important, but education was important not for the reason you might think. You might think education is important because without it, mothers can't read and they can't access the information. But we showed that the information can be given through other means which don't require literacy. But education is very important because it improves bargaining power. So it enables mothers to actually make positive changes for their children, which they don't feel confident to do or they're not able to do within the family otherwise. So the basic lesson that I get from this is that we need to learn as much as possible about the root causes of problems and about the type of solutions which can actually produce results in a cost-effective way. And this is quite a cost-effective program because it was nested within an existing BRAC program, and it didn't require any very expensive inputs. And maybe that's the other lesson, and that the other lesson is that development needs to be integrated and comprehensive. But within that comprehensive approach, we need to identify areas where we can make the biggest difference in the areas which really matter. I think that's the conclusion I would reach. Okay.
And can you share with us about some challenges you face when you work in Bangladesh or other developing countries?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think possibly the biggest challenge and maybe the biggest opportunity arose in the Millennium Development Goals. I think the Millennium Development Goals were really helpful because for almost the first time in my experience, different elements came together. So the government, I found during this period of the first 10 years of the 21st century, for example, was really keen on achieving Millennium Development Goals. So they were very open to communicating with and cooperating with NGOs because they felt the NGOs could help them to reach the goals. And one of the best programs that we experienced in BRAC in terms of government cooperation were things like malaria and tuberculosis programs, because the Global Fund was providing the financing for these programs, and the WHO was providing technical advice, and the Global Fund insisted to the government that there had to be a major NGO role in the program. And so there was really close cooperation between the Ministry of Health, the division which dealt with malaria and tuberculosis, and BRAC in particular. But BRAC actually coordinated a whole consortium of NGOs. And people really worked together. They had different roles within the project, but it really worked. And I think that's the kind of cooperation that we need to make long-term. And the other lesson I've learned is that if you want to bring about real change, you have to do it on a long-term basis. You can't have a short-term program for 2 or 3 years. You can have a pilot and evaluate how good it is and then drop it or move it into a bigger program. But you need a long-term approach to tackle problems because it takes quite a long time, and you have to carry on with the things that are working over quite a long period. So those would be the 2 lessons that I think I've learned.
Okay, and just if we want to design a cooperative study of nutrition and early childhood development between developed and developing countries like Bangladesh, so how it will be look like?
Yeah, well, I mean, in a way, maybe the most interesting thing to do. I mean, Bangladesh is an aspiring middle-income country, right? Bangladesh wants to become, will become, I think, a middle-income country. And I mean, I'm also working quite a lot in Vietnam. Vietnam is probably already a middle-income country. So a good comparative study would probably be maybe looking at countries in South and Southeast Asia which are at a comparable level of development. I mean, South Korea, for example, developed very recently. So, and then look at things which worked in that kind of context and see what lessons people. The problem if you go to, if you make a comparison with a developed country is that the amount of resources you have per capita is so much larger, but you may find that the positive results are just related to much larger amounts of resources that you can invest. And I'm not sure how far the lessons are useful, although certainly there are definitely lessons that developed countries can learn from developing countries. I'm sure about that. So I wouldn't necessarily see that you can gain a huge amount from comparing countries with very different per capita income levels. But if you think that the difference between developed and developing is beginning to erode, and we're getting this category of middle-income countries, and some of the middle-income countries are getting some very interesting and positive results. One of the most interesting questions to ask is that some countries which get very good results don't necessarily have very high per capita incomes, and the most famous traditionally in that area are places like Kerala or Sri Lanka, where they get very good results in education and also nutrition, childhood development, without spending very large amounts per capita. And there are some countries which have very high per capita GDP, like the United States, but still has some very bad results. And that's partly because of inequality, so that health resources and nutrition resources are not very well distributed. And in one of the questions you asked me in the questionnaire, you asked me what are the priorities? And for me, a very important priority is to look at Sustainable Development Goal number 10, which is about inequality. And I was in a very interesting seminar with the chief economist of the Planning Commission a couple of years ago, and I asked him about SDG 10, and he took it very seriously indeed. So we should certainly be looking at issues like equality. inequality and equality. But I would find it hard to imagine how you would set up a meaningful study between developed and developing countries. I think looking at a range of middle-income countries might be more productive.
Okay. So, and look, if I ask you that what type of policy we should consider at this moment to tackle the threats of malnutrition for the children due to this COVID, you know that there is a crisis maybe for food, excess of the food, as well as if you look at that, children cannot able to go to the school, even early childhood development may be hampered. So in that perspective, what type of policies we should prioritize at this moment?
Well, I think what you have to do first is to try to determine which groups are being adversely affected. I mean, I'm working in Noakhali in areas, Chor areas. Up to now, we have not had a single case of COVID within the project area, although there's quite a high level of cases where the project office is located, which is in Jonapur in Noakhali Shodhur Upazila. And we were concerned. I mean, there was a lot of concern at the beginning of the lockdown that there would be a lot of problems with families in the project area. For the most part, families involved in agriculture, even quite small farmers, were not very much affected. They're largely subsistence farmers. They're growing a lot of their own food, and local food markets picked up. There were some areas, like some of the small islands, Urichor, for example, which sells milk to dealers, and they weren't able to get a price for buffalo milk and cow milk, but they actually managed to rent boats and take the milk directly to Chittagong and Dhaka. So first of all, we need to find out which particular groups, occupational groups, are really facing problems, and they're essentially people dependent on day labor, whose source of income has been very badly affected during the crisis. Now, in these fairly remote rural areas, almond harvesting or almond transplanting is already going on. Almond harvesting will take place a bit later. So the demand for labor has actually picked up quite rapidly because crops still got planted and still have to be transplanted and harvested. But I think what I would suggest is try to really look at whatever data is available, or even press reports, and identify groups who are clearly adversely affected, and then try to look at the condition of their children and consider what we can do to improve nutritional status. And I think you would then find that you can focus the program quite carefully. Some of those groups were groups which were already suffering quite badly in the first place, and whose condition has been made worse. But I would not try to spread it too evenly across the population, because I think large parts of the population, particularly the rural population, have not been all that badly affected by the crisis.
Andrew, can you also share your understanding the economical perspective of nutrition and early childhood development in Bangladesh? I think that this is important due to motivate the policymakers and high-level government people to understand that it is important to invest in terms of economical perspective. So, can you share your understanding?
Yeah, well, clearly, Bangladesh's biggest asset in economic terms is its people, but the problem with having a large number of people in a modern economy is unless they're well educated and well trained, they don't become as potential. They don't reach their potential as individuals, but also they don't reach their potential in the economic terms. So we need rapidly improving levels of education and training, and that's a big challenge in itself. And we also know that we know from many studies around the world that children start to learn at a very early age, and if they learn well at that age, and they're able to through meaningful play, and they will teach themselves, in effect, a lot of things at a very young age, and then they start to learn much more rapidly in school. And that's very important for the future of the country. And I think educationists know that very well. And in that context, nutrition is important, because poor nutrition leads to much lower levels of activity, and therefore the stimulation is much less, and they will learn less quickly. Now, I'm not an expert in early childhood development, but I think these things are fairly well accepted. And I think you'll find that policymakers, particularly the more well-educated ones and the more thoughtful ones in places like the Planning Commission, know that perfectly well. The challenge is to find out what are the bottlenecks which are preventing a good early childhood development, whether stunting and wasting are contributing, and I think they are. And then the other challenge is to find out ways in which we can make really substantial and meaningful reductions in stunting and wasting, which will translate into better early childhood development. And I think projects like the one that I just described, and studies like the one that I described, will help in that. And I would encourage you to consider the role of rigorous impact assessment of projects and learn from those impact assessment studies, because they should be able to give us lessons in terms of the best way to bring about positive change. The study that we did, we were brought together by an international organization called International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, 3IE. And they have a lot of information about studies they've carried out, and you can also probably join that organization and have access to their insights. So it's a combination of understanding the potential. I think that can be translated into economic terms, probably. How to look at where the problems are, where the drawbacks are at the moment, and then try to find solutions which work. And in that context, making good use of the potential of impact evaluation.
And so I just want to hear something about the scope of partnership between the organization of those who are working in the nutrition sector and organization those who are working for the early childhood development. Is there any initiative taken by any donors or any government to make some sort of partnership between two types of organizations?
Well, I was working in BRAC from 2007 to 2017, so for 10 years. And in areas like, for example, as I said, malaria and tuberculosis, there was a very close collaboration. And if I look at malaria, for example, BRAC coordinated a group of about 10 Bangladeshi NGOs, particularly in Chittagong Hill Tracts and areas like that. And then we had a very close relationship with the relevant section of the Ministry of Health. And in that context, the donor was the Global Fund, and the Global Fund very much wanted to see this partnership and also involved the WHO in providing technical advice. So that kind of consortium where you have an enlightened donor, government participation, and the right NGOs, and also possibly some knowledge organizations who are doing research, or universities or research institutes, if you can put together that package. And BRAC played quite an important role, because BRAC was much bigger than the other NGOs, and it was able to negotiate with the government and with the WHO and with the Global Fund. So I think those kind of packages or those kind of consortia are the way to go to bring about effective change. And it's probably worth looking at some of those examples and talking to people who've had experience of those and seeing how they work. And I've only worked, the only NGOs I've worked with in Bangladesh have been Oxfam and BRAC. But BRAC was doing a lot of that kind of thing, and was working with quite a lot of local partners, both in terms of universities and NGOs. So a lot of it is about trying to establish kind of dialogue, and then if you're generating knowledge, share that knowledge with people like BRAC and say, look, we can contribute this knowledge. Can we try and find a way to work together? I think to some extent, organizations may feel that they're competing with each other to get access to donor funds, whereas in fact, what we need to do is find ways of working together and involving donors in a particular role. But in that example which I gave of tuberculosis and malaria, the donor role was important, but it wasn't probably not the most important role. All the partners in the consortium had an important role to play. And I've written a very small book called 10 Easy Mistakes in Managing Development Projects. And one of the mistakes is disconnection. And in any initiative, you need 3 or 4 groups of stakeholders to work together. You need participants, stakeholders, beneficiaries, ordinary people, that's one group. Another group is the government. And a third group is usually some non-government input as well. And the fourth group is the donors. And we need to get these groups to work together. And I think you need to explore that. Usually it's advantageous to have some kind of linkage with the relevant government department, even though it can be sometimes frustrating, because without that, we're not going to make progress on a broad scale most of the time, I think. And in some projects, you need the private sector as well. So, the work I'm doing with the World Bank is very much a public-private partnership. So we're working much more extensively with the private sector as well, which is another possibility.
And still now, if I look at that different intervention related to the COVID-19 in Bangladesh, I see that most of the initiative and intervention done by the government, like donors, they have contributed in Bangladesh for COVID-19, but mostly through the government. They give the money to the government, like for doing some research or developing the laboratory as well as the health service care. World Bank, ADB also given lots of money through the government. Still now there is a big gap engaging the NGOs and community-based organizations. So if I place you as a head of a donor, how do you like to engage NGOs for these COVID-related activities? Second point is, as you know that COVID may stay for a long time. So how do you like to make a plan to engage civil societies and NGOs for managing nutrition and early childhood development related activities after post-COVID period?
Yeah, well, actually, I've never worked for a donor. So I think I'm not the right person to ask about how donors.
I know it didn't work, so that's why I ask you that without having your any experience in donor.
Well, I actually,
but
yeah, but
as a development worker.
Yeah. I had 2 jobs in BRAC. One job was the coordinator of the Impact Assessment Unit, but I had another job, and it was the head of the Donor Liaison Office. So I actually represented BRAC to its donors, right? And BRAC, during the time I was there, BRAC developed a long-term strategic partnership with DFID and with the Australian government. So I have learned quite a lot about how you can work with donors. Now, from the donor perspective, there are a number of reasons they work a lot with government. Firstly, because they have bilateral agreements with the Bangladesh government. The second reason is that donors don't have and don't want to spend a lot of time and resources on trying to relate to a large range of small non-government organizations, because that has a lot, very high overhead costs, because they have to relate to a whole range of different organizations, and that's expensive. So it's much easier if they can have a relationship with a large organization like BRAC. That's much cheaper for them. But if then that organization, as was the case with the Global Fund, is able to coordinate meaningful consortium which can produce results, particularly if it can then develop its own relationship with the government, that's a much more attractive option. So I think if you want successful results in terms of non-government organizations relating to donors and making use of donor funding, you need to think about coming together in a form which can be convincing for donors and reduce their transaction costs, because if they have to have high transaction costs, they're probably not going to do it. And then secondly, you need to find a way of forming relationships with the government. So the government, I mean, in the case of BRAC, for example, it was not unusual that the government would say to a donor, look, let's bring BRAC into this because they can provide technical expertise that we don't have. And if you can get to that stage where the government wants to bring you in for that reason, that's also very, very positive. If you can't achieve those things, then I think it's going to be quite difficult to get direct access to donor funding. The other exception could be donors are often quite interested in spending money to see if they can determine effectiveness. So, for example, the nutrition study, the study impact evaluation we did of the nutrition program I just described was actually our partner, the BRAC partner was American Institutes of Research. And American Institutes of Research was able to get funding from DFID to them in America, in Washington, because DFID was very interested in seeing if we could learn lessons from this nutrition program and whether we could have a high standard of rigorous impact evaluation. So if you can find a way to partner with organizations which are able to do effective evaluation and publish the results, that's another way of accessing donor funds. But I think a lot of it is about partnership. That's what I found. I certainly found that when we did the study, we were approached by American Institutes of Research through this international organization that we belong to called 3IE to see if we would partner and then put together a proposal to get the DFID funding to do the study, to do the impact evaluation study. So those would be my suggestions: is try to form effective consortiums, try to develop a relationship with the relevant government department, and try to maybe access relatively small amounts of money to do really good studies of evaluations of initiatives, which would then attract donors to provide more support in future.
Okay. Can you share with us your experience from CDSP regarding the nutrition and early childhood development program?
Yeah. So in CDSP, we're basically focusing on food security, and I mean, we all know that food security by itself doesn't guarantee good nutrition, but it definitely helps. If you don't have food security, then you're probably going to have rather poor nutrition. And that has been the focus in CDSP, because CDSP has not had a nutrition as a major objective. We now have a component which is linked with the gender program, and we are doing some work to improve nutrition through information. The gender program has been quite important, and it's focused largely on participation of women in field level institutions. But it's not a focused nutrition program, and actually we have not used nutrition indicators very much to generate results or to quantify results in CDSP. And if you would like to look at the overall results, then you should look at the report that I referenced, Technical Report 20, which was the completion report of CDSP4, which was produced in 2019, and it's available on the website. And I wrote that down in the responses to your questionnaire. So CDSP did not have a focused nutrition element like the one that I described in the BRAC program, which we studied.
So finally, we like to know your final thought and any recommendation for Bangladesh during this COVID and post-COVID activities.
Well, it's very difficult at this point to know what the longer-term impact of COVID is going to be. I mean, I think that it seems that the effects of the lockdown in some ways were more of a problem for many poor people than the effect of the disease itself, although the disease has certainly been a problem. So far, the prevalence and the mortality rates, at least the reported prevalence and mortality rates, have been relatively low. I mean, I'm sitting in England where we have, I think, 46,000 deaths directly related to COVID so far. We're getting about 1,000 new cases a day, which is about the same as Bangladesh, but the mortality in Bangladesh seems to be much lower. So I'm very hopeful that it won't turn into a kind of huge epidemic in Bangladesh, but I don't know. India, on the other hand, is now, I think, got the third largest number of cases in the world. So maybe it's just taking a long time to get really moving in Bangladesh. I don't know. It's very hard to understand what's happening at the moment. In terms of the economic consequences, there definitely were, at least in the area where I'm involved in Noakhali, there were initially hardship suffered by people who lost access to daily income, but that has picked up in agriculture and in things like local transport, related to food marketing or agricultural marketing and things like that. If Bangladesh gets back to its earlier 6% growth rates, then that's GDP growth by itself is not going to address problems. Interestingly, in terms, as I said to you before, I'm quite interested in inequality and SDG 10, and Bangladesh has done better on inequality than India because the growth in employment in Bangladesh has been in things like garment industry, where the employment has been for relatively low-income people who've been getting jobs, millions of jobs. In India, a lot of the new growth in employment has been in things like telephone call centers, which are much more middle-class jobs. So the effect of industrial development in Bangladesh has been to improve equality to a certain extent, because it's created a lot of jobs for very poor people. But I think the way forward is, as I said before, is to focus on the Sustainable Development Goals and really see if we can find an integrated approach which pays attention to those and identifies the areas where we're not making very good progress and try to improve. Whereas, as I said, Bangladesh did well on the Millennium Development Goals, but there were several where the progress was very disappointing, and nutrition was one of them. So I think we should go forward really as far as possible on the basis of the SDGs, partly because they're a very good framework in themselves, and secondly because potentially they do provide a really big opportunity for donors, government, NGOs, academics, and ordinary people and their own organizations to work together. And I think that's going to be very important to continue to make progress.
Thank you, Andrew. I just want to share with you that we have two colleagues with us. One is Julian and another is Jim with us. And
Great. That's great.
Julia,
Yeah.
do you like to make any comments with us? We'll be happy if you just, make a comment for us.
I also see our friend Julian. I haven't seen you for a while, Julian. How are you?
I'm very well and surviving okay in Dhaka.
Shamimba, you know all about Julian and his history in the country.
Yeah, he recently, got a citizenship from Bangladesh too.
Yeah, he got citizenship.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Absolutely. I
think we lost Jim.
Yeah, we seem to have lost Jim.
Okay.
back?
He's back. Yeah.
I'm back. Okay, good. Your comments, wonderful comments and presentation, triggered a few thoughts in my mind. I wonder if any of you would like to comment on them. One is the challenge of dietary diversity in Bangladesh has so much to do with rice. People still say, if you haven't had rice, you haven't had a real meal. Second is the extraordinary improvements in overall food security in rural areas where it used to be that if you didn't have if you didn't have land, you were hopeless. You may as well move to an urban slum, and that has changed so much. Third, the Alive and Thrive initiative in Bangladesh. I was always so fascinated by the idea of putting those kind of commercials into the World Cup. Fourthly, BRAC's Education for Girls has got to be one of the great success stories of international development of all time. I remember going around to villages in Bangladesh, couldn't find any girl who wasn't in school. And we would ask other people and they would say, we don't know any girls also who aren't in school. At the same time, adolescent girls working so aggressively to prevent any girls from being kept out of school or early marriage. And finally, your comment about working together, so crucial. I have always been critical of the US government for being in the bottom rung as far as the working together goes.
Oh, great. Thanks, Jim. There's a lot there, yeah. Can I respond a bit to those, if you don't mind, Shamim? We did another study. We did another study where we're looking at, for example, we did it for the BRAC seed program, because BRAC's producing seeds, both the HYV seeds in rice and other crops, and also what do you call it? I forgot the name. These not just HYVs, but hybrids. Yeah, also hybrids. And what we found was that in areas, particularly areas which were doing fairly well in terms of agricultural production, per capita rice consumption was dropping quite fast. And what we're seeing is that in rural areas, we're beginning to get more urban food consumption patterns. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is that with increased income, people just want to eat other kinds of food because they like it better. But also, I mean, when I first worked for BRAC in the training center in Sabah in 1979, we organized our first training for landless farmers. And we estimated the amount of food they would eat on the first night when they arrived as a multiple of like we're having 60 farmers and we were 6 people. So we knew how much we were eating every day and we multiplied it by 10. And they ate all the food so fast, all the rice, that we didn't get to eat anything because it was all gone. You know, we were polite, so we waited for them and they just ate it all. It just disappeared. And we realized that they would eat 2 or 3 times as much as us. And by the time they'd been in the training program for a couple of days and they weren't actually working physically hard every day, their consumption also started to go down quite dramatically. And these kind of jobs are beginning to change. I mean, even people who are involved in rural transport of commodities and food, you know, they're driving nosimon and baby taxis and things like this. I mean, the amount of calories that they have to expend is less. So I think we're seeing rice consumption going down per capita quite rapidly. And some of the work I'm doing with agricultural development, you know, we're looking for other crops because we don't see continued growth in agricultural production in continuing to produce more rice, because we don't need as much rice, and also it's difficult to go on increasing the amount of rice. What we can do is produce much more in terms of value, higher value crops, which are meeting this market demand. So I think that's happening. Whether that will automatically improve nutrition is a big question, and I think that has a lot to do with knowledge and information and the extent to which particularly mothers are prepared to accept advice, effective advice. And that's what the presentation was about. And what you said about food diversity, I think that is definitely improving. So I think there are lots of opportunities there. And there's almost a new wave of agricultural development, which includes aquaculture development going on, which is trying to meet these demands. And that's a good thing. Alive and Thrive, yeah, really interesting. I'm a big fan of Alive and Thrive. And in fact, this whole program that I described came from Alive and Thrive. It was the Alive and Thrive team which developed. This was the next stage after Alive and Thrive. So, so that's good. Girls' education, well, you know, I think if there was any piece of research which demonstrated the importance of girls' education, it was this one, because for me, what was really interesting was it showed that education was important in a way we didn't expect. We thought it was going to be about, well, if you can read, you can have access to more knowledge. But in fact, that wasn't the point at all. It was all about confidence and bargaining power. And I think it gives a different dimension to what, you know, education has many purposes. And this was a very important one. Early marriage, yes, very interesting. We did a really interesting study on early marriage. We all know that early marriage has lots of negative consequences. We know that. We don't have to go into that. What causes it? Well, I don't know if you know Shipa Hafiza, who's a huge campaigner against early marriage, and I admire her deeply. And she believed very strongly in basically awareness. We have to create awareness. So we did a study of the Girls Not Brides program, which BRAC was carrying out, mostly through the gender program, which Shipa was leading. The health program was also extremely interested. They turned up at these meetings on early marriage and they said, look, we are trying to achieve the MDG goal of reducing maternal mortality. And the largest number of mothers who die in childbirth are the ones aged between 13 and 16. And these mothers shouldn't be mothers. I mean, this should not be happening. And if we're going to actually improve our statistics and our results in terms of having less mothers die, we need to stop this. So the health program did not see this as a problem with a health solution. They saw it as a problem with some kind of social solution. So then we did a study of that, and we discovered that the program was highly successful at explaining that early marriage was a bad thing. It was illegal. They got that message across. Everybody knew that. Everybody agreed with it. So their attitude changed. So it was CAP study, knowledge, attitude, practice. Knowledge improved tremendously. Attitudes changed, and practice remained exactly the same. So they knew, parents knew they should not be doing this, but they still did it. Now, there are two possible hypotheses that I know of. At the same time, there was a quite interesting Save the Children study, Save the Children Fund study, which was led by an economist, basically, who saw the explanation as an economic explanation. And basically what she said was, the older the girl, the bigger the dowry. So the longer we delay within the family to marry our daughter, the more it's going to cost us. So she tried an experiment with distributing free oil, cooking oil, to families which delayed marriage. Now, this did not compensate. This only compensated to a very limited degree to the economic cost, but she believed it would be helpful. And she got some, that was quite a good, rigorous study, and she got some quite good results. But we tended to think there was a different explanation. And our explanation went like this, because Brack was also at the same time very involved through these adolescent clubs and girls' education with trying to mobilize social pressure to combat sexual harassment. Okay? So our explanation went like this. Girls are going to school and boys are hanging out in tea shops on the way to school, and they're making all kinds of kind of comments, sexual comments about the girls, and the girls get very upset, right? And, oh, sorry, there was a third explanation as well, which I'll come to. So this was the second explanation. The girls get upset, they go back and they tell their mothers, and the mothers tell their fathers, and the parents think, well, this is terrible, what's happening to our daughter, and we better lock her up. So they lock her up. And she drops out of school. Now, we already know from the...
Julian, do you like to add something?
No, continue.
Okay, go ahead.
We already know from the available data that there's a close correlation between early marriage and dropping out of school. What we don't know is, do girls drop out of school because they marry, or do they marry because they drop out of school? Now, in the case of this hypothesis, and by the way, the third reason was lack of good sanitation facilities at school and ability to deal with menstruation and stuff like that. So that's a third factor. But Brack was actually addressing that through its health and sanitation, through its water and sanitation program, quite effectively in schools, and forming brigades of girls who were cleaning the loos and all that kind of stuff. So you can deal with that. But this sexual harassment thing, so they keep their daughter at home. She's no longer in education, and they think, well, she better get married. And that's the explanation. So if this hypothesis is correct, naughty boys harassing girls actually kill them, because they get married too young, they become pregnant, and they die in childbirth. And there's a direct causal link between sexual harassment, and that may well be a very important explanation of early marriage. But one thing which came, I think, very clearly from our study is more and more awareness is not going to solve this problem. More and more awareness that early marriage is a bad thing, because the data that we generated showed that parents know perfectly well that early marriage is a bad thing, but they do it anyway, which means they have other reasons for doing it. And we need to understand and combat those other reasons. And I think dropping out of school because of harassment is a very important factor, and that's something we should be giving attention to. And absolutely. I think, yeah, sorry, Jim.
Absolutely fascinating, Andrew, just fascinating. On the harassment, I hear in India sometimes talk about mothers who spoil their male children. And if somehow something could be done about that, maybe we'd have less harassment. On the subject of the dowry, all of you know that one of the things I had fun doing in Bangladesh was to try and arrange marriages. So I got the nickname Gotuk. And my slogan was Gotuk, but no Jotuk. Matchmaking, but no dowry.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, very good. Anyway, I think I'd like to kind of make 2 points from this. One is that more things are connected than we sometimes realize. So, you know, I think we were exploring the possibility of a direct causal link between sexual harassment and maternal mortality, right? And that's a very interesting hypothesis, which I think can be tested probably. And the second thing is what I was saying earlier, is the value of targeted research to try to answer important questions. Because if we work on the assumption that, okay, girls not brides, let's have more and more efforts into awareness, we can do all the awareness in the world. If we don't address the fundamental reasons, then it's not going to work. And the research which shows that, I mean, we had a lot of trouble in BRAC trying to convince people that this was the case. Because it's very attractive, let's have more and more awareness. But I'm not convinced that, I mean, it's a good thing in itself, but by itself, it's not enough. We have to go further than, we have to understand the situation much better. Okay.
I was just going to say that I don't think there's been enough study recently about the numbers of families that have actually had to leave, say, Dhaka because of losing jobs, whether it's in the garment industry or small businesses, shops. I mean, some reports that have come through, like a family that's been here for the last 12 years, and they've now uprooted either of the Eid festivals, and they haven't come back. They've gone to the village. Now that has completely not only dislocated and questioned about the income of the family, but particularly the education of the children, who may have been in reasonably good primary schools or secondary schools or even colleges, and now they're sort of nowhere. And the numbers, I mean, I've heard in the last few days, somebody said, oh, at least 1 million families have gone. And somebody else said, no, it's more like 5 million. Well, I don't think it's 5 million, but it is quite serious. And you see the situation with the nearly 7-year-old son of my helper, Garo helper at home, and he's was at a decent primary school in Banani, and now they're giving online 1 hour a day, whereas he would have had 3 or 4 hours in the school itself, and yet they're taking the same monthly fee. Now, if his mother didn't have me, that wouldn't be possible. And so, and I don't see enough of the studies done or the data that tells us how serious this is. One of the things that's just come in the media recently has come out of the COVID situation about hand washing, and there's some survey done, I think by BRAC, I'm not sure, that even 40% of the schools before the pandemic didn't even have water to wash hands, never mind soap. So that's at least brought some more awareness about all that. So, but the thing about the number of deaths, which Andrew mentioned, I mean, that's quite correct. But of course, although I don't want to be quoting statements sounding like Donald Trump, but it's partly due to the lack of testing. But the positivity is nearer 30%, I think. It's certainly sort of 25%. So that's quite a high percentage. But on the other hand, we are not getting, I mean, there was another survey done with ICDDRB, I think, and the government, and connected somehow to the Bill Gates Foundation, that has on a sample survey that 9% of the population of Dhaka are infected. symptomatic as well as asymptomatic. So that a lot of infections and a lot of deaths are not properly recorded. We've seen interviews of grave diggers, not just in Banani, but in places like Narayanganj, and he would say that, oh, in April last year, I buried 75 people, and in April this year, 550, but only 80 were designated as COVID. So the statistics, the data just isn't with us, unfortunately. And of course, as you may have seen, even in the foreign press, huge corruption in the health ministry and the Director General of Health Services. So the whole thing is a mess.
Yeah, that's very helpful, Julian. I'm sure that a lot of that's true, and I'm sure we have to be very careful with the official numbers. I mean, the numbers I shared with you the other day, which we're getting on a daily basis for every Upazila in Noakhali, that's coming from the civil surgeon, yes. And that seems to be, as far as I can judge, that's fairly reliable. But that's coming at quite a low level in the system before it's kind of being massaged, possibly. I think if we return to a question about what we could do about this, I mean, I think there are opportunities to do programs which address the COVID situation, but also address longer term issues at the same time. So, for example, having much better sanitation, water and hygiene arrangements in schools would be a very good thing, and it would also be very helpful in the crisis. So the 2030 Water Resource Group, which is this public-private partnership that the World Bank's involved in, that I'm also involved in, did quite a lot of work with Unilever on promoting hygiene throughout the country as widely as possible. And Unilever is quite keen on this because they can supply soap and they want to go on selling soap in future. So they've got an interest in it. But I think something like that can be very helpful, and having much better sanitation and also arrangements for menstruation in schools has a secondary benefit, in that it encourages girls to stay much longer in secondary school. And as I said earlier, we already know that early marriage and dropout of school are correlated, although we don't know the causality of that. So there would be a number of benefits of doing that. And those are the kind of programs where you can see an immediate contribution to COVID, but also some kind of longer term achievement. Another one that the 2030 Water Resource Group's been working on, and I hope we're going to get that supported also probably through DFID and Unilever, is providing PPE to workers in processing waste, who are now receiving an awful lot of COVID-related waste, which has to be disposed of. And the workers themselves need washing facilities, and they need their own protective equipment, and that really needs to get a lot of attention. And when you mention grave diggers, I think how much protection do they get, and how much contact are they having with people with COVID? So if we can identify these particular groups and have focused programs which work with them, which bring about long-term improvements in their conditions, but also things which will help them protect themselves more effectively from COVID, that would be a good thing. And then in terms of reverse migration of people who are distressed and whose education is being disrupted, what I think we need to do, and I hope the BRAC research is showing this, is identify those groups where this seems to be most concentrated, so that you can have programs which focus on that. Otherwise, I can't imagine how you can have an effective, Bangladesh can do an effective program to minimize COVID among 5 million people. I can't see that happening. I think we have to find specific groups which have specific needs and try to meet them. And I think we've come up with 2 or 3 in this discussion, which are quite interesting, I think.
I think the NGOs in Cox's Bazar have not coordinated nearly as well as they should have. and the number of foreigners based there, of course not so many now, but quite ridiculous number of foreigners, and that's something that is difficult to understand, because they didn't, when, for instance, when I was talking to Oxfam, maybe 2 years ago, they had about 60 foreigners working with them in Cox's Bazar, and about just over a year ago, they still had 20. Now, I don't know how many of those were Bengali speaking, but the totally unnecessary, in my opinion. I became a bit, people got angry with me because I kept saying, well, we were looking after 6 lakh refugees in 1971, and we never had more than 4 Bideshis, because we worked through local organizations and local medical colleges and so on. Yeah. And I just don't understand why that could not have happened here, because there are so many medium-sized, I'm not just talking about BRAC, but what I would call large organizations that have had a lot of disaster relief and rehabilitation experience that could have been involved even on a rolling basis of staff. So it's been very disappointing from that point of view. And there are groups of, there is a sort of national coordinating something in Cox's Bazar, and they've been quite outspoken about the number of foreigners taking away money from the locals. So it's I hope this is something that is learned, but I'm pretty depressed about it.
Well, yeah, I just think it's also sometimes useful in this context to, if we can find 1 or 2 good examples, and the one that people in BRAC always talked about was the Global Fund and the TB and malaria program, and that really seemed to work very well. And there were quite a number of NGOs involved, some of them quite small, BRAC really quite large. The government was quite positively involved, and the WHO. But I think the push came from the understanding of the Global Fund, how they wanted to do this, and they wanted to do it as a joint effort involving these different elements. And they were not prepared to provide the funding unless that could be sorted out. And I think donors need to think about that. I mean, I totally understand that donors find it very difficult to relate directly to a whole range of very small local organizations. So there has to be a solution to that.
Yeah, yes, I agree. Yeah.
It's very expensive to have, civil servants from from developed countries spending their time on that. But the Global Fund seems to have found a very effective solution. And I think we need to get that kind of solution working much more effectively in future. Well, Shamim, you've just brought together 3 very old friends who, I don't know if you know how long we've known each other.
Would you like to add something?
Yeah, please.
It's very pleasure for me. Jim, do you like to add something?
You're muted, Jim. Yeah.
I'm just very, very happy we could do this. It's a wonderful shared learning experience, and I don't think I've ever been with Andrew when I haven't learned something interesting, and I can't remember when I've been with Andrew that I haven't learned a new song.
Jim, I just want to say to you personally that we're sending out, I think tomorrow we're going to send out the next round of poems, and your suggested poems included. But there'll be some others as well. So.
Great, great.
Well, you'll be glad to hear that I was singing a song yesterday. I'm not offering to do it again today, but yesterday was International Left-handers Day. So
Yeah, we remembered you. We remembered you. We noticed that. And Jan said it to me yesterday morning. She said we should congratulate Julian. It's his annual day.
yeah, and I wrote my annual piece in the Dhaka Tribune, but I put it in last week because this weekend being much more solemn with the National Mourning Day tomorrow. So
Okay.
I've got 2 writings about Sheikh Mujib already on BD News and Dhaka Tribune tomorrow. So that's the 1971 looking back, whereas we are trying to look forward at the moment when we are talking about these problems.
Yeah. Well, Shamim, thank you very much for taking this. I think
Thank you so much, Andrew, Julian, and Jim. Yep, thank you. And I will try to arrange a program where all of you, including Ted, can stay and we can discuss something. And I'm personally grateful to all of you as you did a lot of things for Bangladesh. Bangladesh will be grateful to you, and we'll remember you always. You are our good friend, and we really love you from our heart.
Well,
And
thank you very much.
I send you a copy of the paper which has all the data from the study that I talked about. So
Okay.
do please distribute that, because I think it's a very good paper. Okay, great.
Okay.
Okay. I'll do it.
Well, we'll stay in touch, and see you again, Julian and Jim. And
Yes, well, look forward to whenever that might be.
yeah,
We don't know.
Jules Jim. I don't know if you've seen the film, but there's a famous film, Jules Jim. Okay, great. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.